So hello everyone, my name is Nir Evron. I'm the chair of the Department of English and American Studies at Tel Aviv University. I'm very happy to see such a large group assembled here and an even larger crowd at home watching via Zoom. As you know, events of this kind are becoming a rarity, or have been for the last couple of years, and for all we know might become impossible again for a while. So it's a great pleasure to be able to hold this evening, and thank you all for coming out or tuning in, despite the inclement weather and other hazards. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to thank a few individuals who helped make this event possible. First, let me thank the efficient and enthusiastic staff here at Beit Ariela, Uri Ellis, Sivan Shor, Yuli Shapira and their team. It was really a pleasure to work with them. Thanks also to Sharon Ziv Kafri at Tel Aviv University, and especially to our department's resourceful and determined administrator, Meital Galili. This event is funded by the Yael Levine Writer-in-Residence program. The long-standing support of Yael Levine's family has enabled us to invite numerous speakers to Tel Aviv over the years, and enriching the cultural life of the department, and fostering really valuable ties between the worlds of literature and academia. We cannot be thankful enough for their contribution. Orna Bird-Lior, Yael Levine's niece, has kindly agreed to say a few words about her aunt and her legacy. And Orna could not be here in person tonight, so she recorded a brief statement instead, which we'd like to show now. Thanks.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight to our annual event. My name is Orna Bird-Lior. My aunt Yael Levine, in whose honor we, her family, initiated the program of author-in-residence at the Tel Aviv University, was a remarkable woman. She was born in Haifa in 1914 and died in the year 2000. She was an exceptionally bright woman who was an English scholar, a diplomat, as well as a devoted daughter, sister, and aunt. Yael graduated from the University of Beirut and worked as an English teacher at the Reali School in Haifa. She was then enlisted to the Foreign Office, and in that very male-dominant environment of the time, she managed to steadily climb the hierarchy ladder until she was posted as the second in command to the embassy in Belgium. No doubt she would have reached higher had she not resigned her post in order to help her sisters look after their mother, who was bedridden for many years. Yael never married and had no family of her own, but was always very close to her numerous nephews and nieces. We all adored her and admired her quick wit and her sharp tongue. Her English literature library was exceptional, and her skills at Scrabble were second to none. We all dreaded her inevitable 7-letter words in every game. She was deeply loved and is remembered fondly till today by every one of us. Thank you and enjoy tonight's lecture.
So introducing Nikola Krauss before a Hebrew-speaking audience is easy work. Few contemporary American writers are as well known and admired here, and there are many reasons for her popularity, which has long transcended national borders. But her special place in this country, I think, naturally stems from the fact that so much of her work touches on themes and places that have particular resonance for Israeli readers. An intimate outsider, Krauss casts a quizzical yet knowing glance at this place and its foibles, presenting her readers with a portrait which is both immediately recognizable but also distant and strange. Described by the New York Times as one of America's most important novelists, Krauss is the recipient of numerous awards and accolades, including the William Sarian International Prize for Writing and the Anisfield Wolf Book Award. Krauss's 4 novels, Man Walks Into a Room, The History of Love, Great House, and Forest Dark, have all been translated into Hebrew, And I hear that her latest book, To Be a Man, a collection of short stories, is due to appear in Hebrew in a few weeks. Nicole's interlocutor this evening will be Dr. Hannah Pauline Galai. Dr. Pauline Galai is a senior lecturer in the Department of Literature at Tel Aviv University, where she is also head of the Goldreich Family Institute for Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture. Hannah's first book, Ecologies of Witnessing, Language, Place, and Holocaust Testimony, came out with Yale University Press in 2018, and she is currently writing a book on the perceived metamorphosis of the Yiddish language during the Holocaust. Please join me in welcoming Nicole and Hannah.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Hi, Nicole.
Hi.
So you're being interviewed by a big fan. Are you okay with that?
Well, we've already met, so you're not a fan anymore. You're now an acquaintance.
Oh, I like that. So let's start with Tel Aviv. It's Omicron season, it's storm season, and somehow you've made it. What interests you about this city?
There are so many things that I hate to miss when I'm not here, and I'm first and foremost here as a person who misses her friends and misses her family. And then I'm here also as a writer who is delighted to be able to talk to students at the university and to understand what they're thinking. And then I'm also here as a writer who is endlessly observing and taking this place in. And I feel like, it's getting harder and harder to get here. So I'll take my chance when I get it.
Great. Actually, if you don't mind, maybe we could hear a little bit of how our city appears in one of your novels, Forest Dark.
See if I remember what I wrote. They were all out. Okay, this is on the beach. They were all out, the possessed mat-court players, the only barely Jewish Russians, the lazy couples with young babies, the girls who, caught off guard by the sun, figured that their bras could pass as bikinis. Just as the inhabitants of Tel Aviv refused to believe in the need for central heating, so they also seemed to insist on going around underdressed, in T-shirts and flip-flops, always unprepared for the rain, or surprised by the cold. And at the very first sign of sun, they rush outside to resume their usual positions. In this way, the whole city seems to have agreed collectively to deny the existence of winter, to deny, in other words, an aspect of their reality because it conflicts with what they believe about who they are, a people of sun, of salt air, and sultriness. A people who are, in that moment of sunbathing, of forgetfulness by the sea, as related to missiles as a man is related to the flight of a bird. And yet, isn't it true of all of us that there are things we feel to be at the heart of our nature that are not borne out by the evidence around us? And so, to protect our delicate sense of integrity, we elect, however unconsciously, to see the world other than the way it really is. And sometimes it leads to transcendence, and sometimes it leads to the unconscionable.
Thank you. Do you ever have characters that you've described in Tel Aviv pop out and discuss their depictions with you? Like, hey, yeah, that was me in a bra on the beach in the sun.
Yeah, when it happens all the time. I went to go get my COVID test to get out of isolation, and I gave my sticker, and as he was shoving the Q-tip up my nose, he said, "I'm such a fan of your books." And there's a scene described in there by the character Nikolle, of going to her brother's wedding at the King David Hotel, and as the toasts go on, she's desperate to go to the bathroom. She rushes out to the lobby, and someone stops her. This did happen. Someone stops her and says, "Are you Nicole?" And she says, "Yes," like trying to run to the bathroom. And this new mother pulls the hood over the baby's pram, pulls it back, and there's this screaming baby there. And she says, she tells her name, which is the name of a character in one of the books she's written. She says, "Because of you." So I think things like that happen to me here, maybe more than other places. And I sometimes joke about this with friends, and we can't decide whether it's just because this is a smaller place and everybody is more recognizable, or because Israelis are not shy about saying whatever they want whenever they want when they see you in the street.
Well, it could be a bit of both. And another reason is that I think there's something enriching about seeing this reflection of oneself in a writer who is interested and, as Nir described you, a close, an intimate outsider of sorts. And in fact, we did an exercise in our class in preparation for your visit. I asked the students to describe themselves as they might appear in your next novel. And it started out as a whimsical task, just to kind of get a laugh out of my students, but it turned into something much deeper, I think, because envisioning how you might see them allowed us to ask questions about ourselves and how we fit into the space. I'm actually going to read you an example, and he's here tonight, so you can look around and try to spot him.
By his
Okay,
blush?
This is Ido Balas. He's a graduate student of mine, and he wrote, "The task of reading aloud a passage from Kraus's book was entrusted to a bald student of Mizrahi descent. He was probably selected for the job as a way to showcase the success of the melting pot project Israel is so proud of. So how do you create your characters? What is your writing process like when you create characters?" Okay, you can take time to laugh.
I don't, I think you and I have already spoken about this briefly together, and we'll probably come back to it, but I want to say before I give any other answer that the work that I do and the way that I approach writing is really instinctive. It's really about following certain kinds of intuition. So I, in fact, am not aware of creating a character ever. I'm only aware of having created a character when the book is live to me or live to somebody else. But I think I start with language before I start with personhood. Something will happen in a sentence that I'm writing about someone or in someone's voice, and it will simply come alive. And in that moment of coming alive, so does my curiosity. And a kind of affection is forged between me and whomever I'm writing about. And I think that affection is important to me. I don't know that I could write well about someone. I don't need to like them per se. I think affection is different. I could feel their difficulty. I could feel that I wouldn't want to sit in a room with them, but I can feel some kind of compassion and affection for them. And when that happens and that curiosity is invoked, I know I'm onto something. And then it's just a path of asking a lot of questions and living with that person as they become that to me.
It's really interesting to me that you would use the word compassion in the way you look at characters. Actually, that words come up in discussions about your books when I've taught them multiple times. I've been lucky enough to teach them with multiple classes. In Hebrew, they say that you have an ayn chomelet, you have a compassionate eye. And actually, I think that might help us go back to the first question, which is why Tel Avivis or why Israelis are interested in your work, because I think they feel a sense of compassion in the way you're looking at them. And is it difficult to write about Israel as an American writer now? I mean, if people don't read your work and see all the complexity and they just say, oh, here's an American writing about Israel, excuse me, does that create challenges in today's climate?
I'm sure that it does. I see them occasionally in reviews of my work, but for the most part, I haven't encountered that yet. I'm sure that I've lost readers, not because necessarily I'm writing about Israel, but I've lost readers because I'm not interested in writing about what people want me to write about. And so that means that I go to places that are more obscure to what a natural audience would be for an American writer. I go to places that people might not want to look at as much, or situations or feelings. So it's just not part of my thinking. And I'm sure there's a cost to that. But obviously the gain is a certain kind of artistic freedom that otherwise I wouldn't be able to write the books that I do.
So you don't have people asking you to sort of answer for Israel on a political level?
I do, sometimes. But I try to point out that those are not the interesting questions to ask me. But I have to say that's rare. I think this is, again, one of the unique things about being, this word has been stuck in my mind for a couple of days, interstitial, like a writer who is between, in the space between. And I feel that deeply, like I feel that in a level of soul. I don't feel particularly American. I never did when I was growing up. I certainly don't feel Israeli. I don't feel European, obviously, but I feel between all of those places. And that does grant me not, it grants me, the cost of it is that don't feel at home anywhere, but it does grant me a position of being able to be, as you said, or maybe as Nir said, I can't remember, both fully in something and removed from it at the same time. And I don't think, so therefore I don't think I'm asked the same questions, for example, that an Israeli writer would get when taking her work outside of Israel.
So I know from reading, and I know from our brief discussions, that you don't write on a political level intentionally. There are interesting ways, especially in Forest Dark and in several of the stories that have come out in To Be a Man, where Palestinian lives, Palestinian problems appear integrated into the story. In Forest Dark, there's a coat that ends up in Gaza, and there's the phone there that takes pictures and happens to capture an emaciated boy. And there's an incredibly moving part at the end of the novel where your character, Nיקol, is very, very ill, and there's a Palestinian or Arab orderly. I wonder if you could read that, and we can just talk about how you came to that place.
Okay, she has a kind of something, a virus, before this virus, but nobody knows what it is. I remember that the Arab man went past, and I watched him pushing the long rectangular mop that left behind a wet, shiny trail like a slug. A few minutes later, he reappeared, pushing the mop back in the other direction, and when he got to my cubicle, he stopped and looked in. He had kind eyes, deep and brown, and seemed too old to be doing such work. After a moment, he put the mop down and approached me. I thought he might remove the stethoscope from around his neck and use it on me, or maybe I hoped he would, because by then I was in need of an act of kindness. But instead, he reached out his hand and pressed the back of it to my forehead and then my cheek, said something quietly in his language, and disappeared, leaving the mop where it was so that I understood that he would return. When he did, it was with a nurse I hadn't seen before, slender with gray roots in her blonde hair. I thought I might have a better chance with her, and so I tried again to describe what had happened to me. The nurse put a hand on my arm and turned to the computer station on a trolley, making it clear that everything she needed to know would come not from me, but from that other, more reliable source. Once she'd caught herself up, she turned and asked the orderly a question in Hebrew, to which he answered in the affirmative, taking the opportunity to pop into the cubicle and retrieve his mop with its dirty, tangled head, before retreating back to the hallway. He continued to stand there, absently twisting the handle between the hands he'd used to gauge my temperature, and whose accuracy would now be checked against the thermometer in its disposable plastic sheath that the nurse stuck under my tongue. It began to beat wildly, and the nurse snatched it out of my mouth with a perturbed look that soon shifted to surprise. She went away and came back with some bitter syrup in a paper cup, and then vanished again, presumably to find the doctor. What I remember next is that the orderly, still standing in the hallway, now looked around him furtively, first left and then right, until, judging the coast clear, he approached again, rested the mop against the wall, and again laid his hand on my forehead, this time with the palm down so that I felt the refreshing coolness of his skin. Looking up at his face, it seemed to me that he was listening intently, as if he were straining to hear after all, not with the stethoscope that still hung inert around his neck, but with the hand itself, as if the sensitive instruments of his cool fingers could read my mind. And though I know it is impossible that the memory I invoked under his touch had not yet happened to me, it is there all the same, impervious to reason.
Thank you. That was beautiful to hear it from you.
Thank you.
So how did you end up with an Arab orderly saving this character's life, and saving the character's life in more ways than one, right? Physically, noticing the fever, and also emotionally unleashing this vision of love that comes after this, that the Arab orderly's touch allows her to picture herself in an intimate, loving relationship. How did that happen?
Again, instinctively, but in retrospect, she's in this hospital and what she has can't be defined medically, and yet, or ever. And she's suffering from something. You've been with her now through much of the book. She's just survived a kind of extraordinary period in the desert, alone in a house that might or might not have belonged to Kafka. And she's sort of barely survived, and she has this fever, but what she's suffering from is a kind of spiritual fever. I mean, she's suffering from a kind of revelatory virus. And that couldn't be understood by medicine. And so I think my instinct was, there is another language that needed to be spoken there. There needed to be another language that was beyond the one that everyone around her was speaking, and who could speak that language, and who might be connected to that. And I think so that it just made a kind of sense to me. But again, I don't really interrogate those instincts. It's only after I've written that they are luckily interrogated, I think, or thought about or considered by readers. But for me, the process is not that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, we don't necessarily go to a novel to have a political treatise, but politics is based on ethics, and ethics are often based on instinct, no?
I would say something a little different about politics and literature, which is that I really do, the politics as we often think about it is antithetical to what literature does. Politics needs to think about people in large groups or masses. It needs statistics. It needs numbers that are, the opposite of what it means to raise an individual up and to say this person existed and only existed this once and will never exist again, and let us pay attention. Let us be attentive to that person. And let that attentiveness to the one and the singularity and the uniqueness of one teach us something about what it means to be human together. It's not the work of politics. And so my resistance to talking about the work as political comes from that way of thinking. Of course, everything that we write about many places and people will have the inflection of what is political, what we think of as political. But my point is the engine, the position is not that.
Mm-hmm. The last phrase in this passage you just read, it's beyond reason, right? I want to talk to you about that. I am really interested in what I, as a reader, feel in this book, and also in at least the story Seeing Roshadi, as an invitation to think a little bit beyond reason. Maybe sometimes I say to myself as a reader, a boredom with rationalism, or an interest in different forms of consciousness. And what is that about?
I think there was an interest when I was writing Forest Dark for me in the limitations of what we think of when we talk about reality, and some of that started with the question of how we construct our vision of reality. And that thinking went back to my first novel. I wrote it about a man who had lost his memory and so had lost some element of how he had constructed himself. And I remember I was reading a lot of Oliver Sacks at the time, and I was fascinated by this idea of memory as prioritizing not accuracy, but prioritizing coherence. And then that whole idea of how do we construct this off, and how is memory this creative act. So that's been with me for 2 decades, that thought. And I think in Forest Dark, it advanced to this question of why do we, if we know that the self is a narrative and our memories are serving that narrative, and we know that it is a creation, why is it so narrow, and why do we suffer it so badly? Why don't we expand it when we can, or the way we do when we step into the realm of literature, where we feel infinitely expandable according to the characters and the lives we live there? Mm-hmm. So there was that element, and then there was the other element of just perceived reality that I was thinking about. Why, when we know that which we see as solid is like atoms in a void, it's not solid, or all of these things that we have learned as a species to take for granted that as true that aren't true. Why do we not question those things? Because we're all longing for something behind the surface.
So it's a type of expansion of reality that in the end of the day is rational?
No, I mean, I think, for many centuries we've been serving the God of the rational. Mm-hmm. In a way, we all know what we're talking about when we say that. And I think you're right that I'm interested in something more flexible. I'm interested in something more mysterious and magical, but that I don't feel as any less true. Is that a better way? That feels a better way to put it for me.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of mystery, there's some mysticism in your work, and you have characters who come from deeply religious backgrounds, and you have some Kabbalah, some Talmud, but you it seems to stop short of having a character who is faithful or in the present. Can you talk about that? I mean, does that have something to do with you and your relationship to faith?
I guess that position interests me less because it has less conflict in it, as I imagine it. I'm interested in, I think we all are, writers and generally are interested in the moment of wrestling, the place in a person's life or soul or personality that is in conflict with herself. And so a true believer, a whole believer, wouldn't be someone I would want to spend years fleshing out, because it's already a story that has an end, that's known. But those cracks in our being that cause us so much trouble in ourselves and then in our relationships to others, those are the ones that I think somewhere in one of these books somebody says something about pitching their tents there, and that is the place where I like to pitch my tent.
Mm-hmm. Now, this might be just me, but in the way that you talk about exploring consciousness and observation and observing things until the reality shifts, I hear some Saul Bellow. I mean, granted, he didn't read Oliver Sacks, he read Rudolf Steiner, but is there... can you talk about, you've written about him, and you wrote an introduction, right, to one of his stories. Can you talk about your readings of Saul Bellow? Has he influenced your work?
You have some relationship to a film that's coming out about him, no?
I do, but this is unrelated.
Okay, yeah. No, I just heard that and I forgot.
It's not me. I'm my own person. Don't judge me, okay?
I don't know the relationship, but I would love to see the film, because he's a writer that I really... I think, I used to read him when I was in search of, energetic language. Sometimes we get hungry for something and we don't know what it is that we want, and you just have an appetite for something and you need to taste it. And sometimes I needed to taste that, Belovian robustness of language, which is so energetic. I always felt like he, forgive me for saying this for those who love him, he didn't write great novels. He wrote great sentences and great paragraphs, and he wrote brilliant ideas. But his novels as a whole, I never felt I could understand how they worked. I didn't think they always held together. But of course, he was important to me. I wish more people read him. Even in the States, he's less and less read. So I would like to see the film. I hope somebody will tell me about it.
I can help you out with that,
Great.
but we'll discuss that later. What about Philip Roth?
What about him?
Okay. Well, I think I saw a documentary film once where you said that you've lived with Philip Roth's jokes. Is this still something true?
Well, I mean, we were friends for many years, and so I lived with his jokes on the page and off. Sure, yeah. I mean, I think of things he said all the time because he just had like this wonderfully humorous angle at which he approached life. For example, I'm often asked about, and maybe you're going to ask me, maybe you did already ask me, about sort of the line of continuity between me and my characters, what is autobiographical and what is not. And Philip had this great line where he would sit down with his interviewers and he would say, everything in this book actually happened. Now what do you want to know? But he would say, he would be telling some great story, and I would say, that's really good, you should use that. And he would say, I'm retired, I'm not using it anymore. And I would say, I should use that. And he would say, if you can pick it up and carry it out of the room, it's yours.
That's great. That's generous. That's nice. So
not really. It's a little challenging, isn't it? If you can pick it up and carry it out of the room. I think I can. I think I can.
So Saul Bellow didn't want to be a hyphenate. He didn't like it when people called him an American Jewish writer. Philip Roth likewise refused to have a Jewish funeral. I know you bristle at being called an American Jewish writer. Is there actually a ritual of being an American Jewish writer and saying you don't like being called an American Jewish writer?
I don't, it's funny, I don't feel I bristle at all. I always say, I try to say something along the lines of, it's just not my job to consider myself, because the question is usually, do you consider yourself a Jewish American writer? I just don't. I really try to avoid that occupation, and I learned that really early on in order, again, to like salvage whatever amount of freedom I could have as a writer. I simply don't want to be any one thing or be pigeonholed as any one thing. And so I just move away from that in my own mind. Am I surprised when other people say it? Of course not at all. Am I offended? Of course not. Do I wish I were called, I don't know what, a French writer? Obviously not. So I am what I am, and I will be described the way I am. But it's just not in my own vocabulary of thinking about myself.
So in that sense, I feel like you're going a bit up against the grain in terms of contemporary culture. I mean, the New York Times had as every other week, an article that the headline is, as I want to say this. As I'm an American Jew and I have to say this, or I'm a Hispanic, conservative and I have to say this idea of having an identity, and that if you're not that identity, you're appropriating, right? So how do you feel did you feel like contemporary, what's called identity politics, for lack of a better term, do you feel like contemporary identity politics shape the way that you write or think, or you have to fight against something there?
I don't. I think that's newer in a sense. It really didn't exist in the same way when I was growing up as a writer. And this notion of appropriation, I think, when I was really young and learning to write, in which I felt absolute freedom to try anything on, would have been crazy to me. And I still feel, as much as I recognize that it's really far past the time in which certain voices are heard and listened to, I don't think that's the same as disallowing or, blocking artists from being able to touch that material if they don't share the same background or experience. You don't have to read it if you don't want. You can not like it. But why limit the artist's freedom? And the act of cancellation is one of the most violent things we could have invented in a world and a moment in which we desperately need different voices and need, to hear things which we don't want to hear.
Speaking of cancellation, there was a panel recently at UCLA which was titled, and I'm paraphrasing, "Enough Already with Philip Roth?" ? And it was about the male legacy of American Jewish literature. What would you have said if you were on that panel?
I mean, enough already of consciousness. I mean, he was exploring his consciousness. That's what he was doing. Does it interest you? If it doesn't, don't read it. It interests me. I think there is so much brilliance in what he was doing. Do I like everything? Do I wish he would have done this or that? Sure, sometimes the same with every single writer. But he was exploring what it was to be inside his particular mind, and what a place to be it was.
Do you feel in any way that it is a male legacy that you're working with, that you're changing something?
I think when I was becoming a writer, when I was young, I felt that it was very difficult. It was more difficult, certainly, than it is now, 20 years later, to be taken seriously as a woman. And I was aware of the difficulty of what lay ahead of me. There were choices that I made that I would hope would support that seriousness rather than anything that might throw it into doubt, whether it be how you're photographed or what you agree to wear in those photographs, or what interviews you agree to do, what you write about. I mean, even to some degree, choosing to write at times in a male voice equally as in a female voice, I'm sure in part was a sort of act of resistance of not wanting to be pigeonholed into what in those years, so now I'm talking about like the mid-90s and late 90s, was just freely called chick lit. That's how people would refer to a lot of literature by women, was chick lit. And so I think that has changed remarkably in these 2 decades, and I think that there's an understanding, at least in the States, if not in other countries. I mean, it's not yet the same in Italy, for example, where I just was and was having conversations about this. But in the States, I think there's an understanding that much of the most interesting literature being written now is by women, and that's been the case for a long time. And it's recognized, I think, much more.
Wait, so you go to Italy too? We're kind of jealous.
Yeah, I was just there. My first event in person after whatever it was, 2 years of COVID, was in Venice, and it was really nice to be with people again like this.
So there's a recent book that came out, a scholarly work by a scholar named Benjamin Schreier called The Rise and Fall of Jewish American Literature, the fall being, of course, now. Do you agree with this assessment in any way?
Again, it wouldn't even occur to me to think about that. Forgive me, really, but it wouldn't even, I haven't a desire to write. I'm here for a reason. I feel I have some kind of vocation, and I do what I do, whether it's wanted or not, whether it's good or not good. I really have no choice. And so those kinds of questions are not, I understand your position, and I'm grateful that you exist and that you might think about those things, or even that he might think about those things. I don't know what his conclusions are, but thank goodness that somebody would like to think about that. But it's not my job.
What about the fall of literature in general? I mean, there's a worldwide crisis in literacy, and on the internet now, people record themselves complaining about their mothers for 10 minutes and there are 10 million views, and that's a narrative. Does that at all shape what you do?
I think I worry a lot about our attention, and I worry about the fact that we're losing our ability to read deeply. We're losing our ability to make sense of illusions and complex juxtapositions and all of the kind of emotional work that needs, the slow processing that needs to be done when we read a novel. We are reading faster, we're cherry picking for information. Our children are magnificent at that kind of reading, but whether we all are preserving that other kind, that deep, slow reading, is hard to say, and I think that's the kind that has a chance at changing us at core, internally, doing the things that literature has always done, and affording us this opportunity, which only literature affords us, which is to step into another person's mind and understand what that feels like. We don't get that anywhere else. And so it worries me that we're losing our ability to do that, and that readerships are shrinking, and the books that are being read are increasingly commercial. But again, I'm kind of a hopeful person, and I do think that these things have survived worse.
Mm-hmm. What are you reading right now?
I'm reading. Does anyone here like or love Natalia Ginzburg, the Italian writer? I'm reading some of her novels. I love her essays, and I've always gone back to her essays and her novels. I'm reading some of her novels now. If you haven't read her, she's absolutely brilliant. And I guess I would recommend starting with a book of essays of hers called Little Virtues, and going from there. But she had a kind of extraordinary life, and a really just unusual mind.
All right, I'm going to allow myself a fun question before I open it up to the audience. Not that the previous questions have been fun, but this is a little bit sillier. So people write about your work, and they talk about your work. What's the worst interpretation of your work that you've ever heard or read?
Wow.
You can take a moment to think. There must have been a lot of bad ones.
Wow. I think let me think about it, and if anything comes to me, but clearly I have wiped them from my mind. In a self-defensive, self-survival mode. But if I think of anything, I'll come back to you.
All right, think about it while we gather questions from the audience, and I hope we can hear at least one just for fun. Yes, please.
I wonder, as a person that write, what do you think the essence of art or artist man?
That's a big question. I guess it changes with time, but when I look back on my life and what art has meant to me from a young age, and finding, for example, poetry when I was 13, and understanding what could happen to me when I stepped not just into the realm of literature by reading, but by writing, what I could do, as Ohad Narin would say, on a molecular level to myself. I think I discovered it as a form of spiritual enhancement and as a kind of infinite expansion, the possibility of infinite expansion of the self, that you can just grow, that these limitations that we feel in life and in our being can sort of be dissolved when we enter into the realm of literature. And though we can't always take that back into our lives, some of it remains, some essence of that remains. Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes, please. אני אחזור על השאלה. אוקיי, בסדר. תשב ואני אחזור על השאלה.
I was born in Brooklyn and I live in Tel Aviv. And
I'll repeat the question for those on Zoom. We discussed how Tel Aviv and Israel inform your writing. How do Brooklyn and New York work their way in?
I guess in a similar fashion. I don't, because I spend more of my life there, I feel in a daily way perhaps less like I'm less alert to the character of people around me, or the weather, or the smells, or I feel like when I travel, so this is not just to Israel, but for example, the most recent book of stories goes to Kyoto, it goes to South America, it goes to France, it goes to Switzerland. And I feel like when I am elsewhere, wherever elsewhere is to me, whether, again, that might be a spiritual position too, I feel like I'm more alive and more alert. And so it becomes easier to write about those elsewheres than it is to write about the room that I live in, for example, or the city that my kids go to school in, because I'm busy like thinking about what to cook for dinner, or the banality of life. And some of that seeps into my writing, absolutely, it does. But again, I feel like it's the elsewhere that I see most sharply.
Something about this question reminds me of another topic. I mean, there's a type of worldliness in your writing, maybe increasingly. You know, Japan, Iran, of course, Israel, South America, perhaps. Does this say? I know that you've described how this works for you as a writer, but does this also say something about American identity or Americanness? I mean, is there such a thing as an American writer now, or is America kind of a perch to see the world from?
I mean, I think it's complicated because a lot of writers who are young and being read now in America do come from elsewhere, and they're writing about that elsewhere. They're writing about growing up in Nigeria, or they're writing about growing up in Mexico City. I think I'm slightly different in that I was born in New York. I grew up in New York, but I grew up in a family that was not American and that came from many different places. And so that it was more of a sense of being from a variety of elsewhere, is not one single place that I could feel an authority on. And so I think my sense of like being American is not, you know, it's different.
Not generalizable.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Good. Any more questions? Yes, please. I'll repeat it. You can ask.
We're sitting here in masks. I happen to be reading the new Gary Steinhardt novel about, it incorporates the pandemic. I'm curious if you think the pandemic is going to make it into your literature, and if you feel the experience of COVID and life in COVID has changed your writing at all, changed your perspective in New York. I'm just curious about how you are processing this period.
Thank you. So the question is about how the pandemic may or may not shape Nicole's work, or even make it in as a topic of her writing.
So I haven't written about it, but in the new collection of short stories, there are two stories. One of the oldest story is called Future Emergencies, and it was written almost 20 or more than 20 years ago, right after 9/11. And it's a story about people who are living in New York and are told via radio and television that something has happened. They're not told what, but they all have to go get gas masks. And everyone in the story is walking around with these masks, or about to be walking around with them. But the story is really about a young woman in her relationship with her older boyfriend, who used to be her professor, back when that happened. And it's a story about intimacy. It's a story about intimacy that's invaded by or colored by global or world or local large events, catastrophic events. But it's not about the catastrophe of the event. It's about what happens within the relationship. And there's a second story. So that's the earliest story. The last story I wrote for the collection of 10 stories is called Amour. And it takes place in a future refugee camp in America. And again, it's about someone who meets by chance a woman that he once had a crush on, that he once sort of loved and hasn't seen her all these years, and they find themselves thrown together in this refugee camp, and it's about their conversations, what happens between them. And again, I think that interests me. I don't feel drawn to writing about the pandemic per se. I will always feel drawn to writing about the intricacies of people's lives. But how those things drip and flow into our intimate lives is fascinating to me.
So, as a follow-up question, you mentioned intimacy and love here. This is one area of your work where I don't see Philip Roth or Saul Bellow influencing you at all, or I guess I see something completely different. Aside from your own instinct and your own sense of what love and intimacy should be, do you have any writers who inspire you in that area?
I guess a lot, and then they're probably mostly women, but again, I think my interest recently and in the recent work, particularly these stories, has been in the conflict that many of us feel, and we feel it at different times in our lives, I think, about where we land in the spectrum between the comfort of togetherness, of the stability and the safety of relationship and being part of a family or a couple, and our desire to be free, and our desire to be free to evolve and to change and to experience, and how we're constantly navigating that. And from the time we're young, when we want to be with our mother, and then we want to be independent and pushing and pulling, but all through life. So I think that the stories are on that, a lot of the stories take place on that threshold. I don't know, I think, I'm influenced by life in that case more than any particular writer.
Let's take one last question from the audience. Yes, please, in the back.
Who are you writing for? Like, who's the audience that you think about things, like person out of yourself?
Great. So the question is, who are you writing for?
I'm like writing to scratch an itch. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm writing because there's something that I can't get at any other way, and it feels bothersome and urgent, and it needs my attention, and I want to make something good out of it. It's not a person that I'm writing for. I don't have anyone in mind, not even myself. It's just some mysterious thing that feels good to me when it doesn't feel terrible. It feels really good because I feel like I am making good on a life and something I was given. I'm trying to make a shape out of it, and then I'm relieved if I can do it.
So you've had some time. Have you come up with any bad readings of your work yet?
Oh God, no. And I think that and they would have to be, I would have to name names. But I'll say one thing, which is not a bad reading, but sometimes readings that I don't understand of my work can push me to new places. So just for example, when Great House came out, we talked about this together, maybe that's why it's on my mind, but there was a review of it in Haaretz, and I don't remember any of the reviews of Great House and what they said, and I don't even remember if this review was good or bad, but this review was memorable because it was written by a psychoanalyst, Carlos Stregner, and he psychoanalyzed me in it, and what he more or less said was that I, as a writer, he felt was suffering under the burden of Jewish history, and that I was kind of wanted to get out from under it, that I felt it as a burden. And that led to a short story in the new collection called Sushi on the Roof, and it led to a lot of thinking about that. So again, I don't know that his reading was right, and I don't know that it was wrong, but it made me wonder, and it led me down a path.
So you're not sure about the burden?
I just feel I've been lucky enough to also carve out an enormous amount of freedom for myself in life. But at the same time, there's something that calls me back to 3,000 years of history that I feel like is mine or that I necessarily feel that I need to engage with. But whether that's a burden and when it becomes a freedom and where one thing ends and another begins, I can't always say.
So seeing you here on the stage, getting to talk to you, which is a tremendous privilege, and also seeing all of you here live and online, it reminds me of a beautiful paper that a student once submitted to a class of mine about your novel, The History of Love, focusing on the way that you use the phrase, "and yet." So there's a pandemic, there are flight restrictions, and yet you are here. There's rain, there's terrible weather, and yet people have come to listen. Everyone says that there's no room for literature, no one has time to read, and yet we do. So would you mind reading a short passage that contains that phrase?
Sure, with pleasure. For years, I continued to hope that things would turn out differently, but I never looked in the mirror and confused what I saw for anything but what it was. With time, I thought about it less and less, then hardly at all. And yet, it's possible that some small part of me has never stopped hoping, that even now there are moments when I stand in front of the mirror, my wrinkled picture in my hand, and believe my beauty is yet to come.
Thank you.
Sure.
So, yeah, definitely. Well deserved. In the spirit of all the beauty that is yet to come, and the books that have yet to be written and read, thank you, and thank you all. You've been a wonderful audience, and for the great privilege of talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.